violent explosion shook the air, and a spout of water, steam, mud, and shattered metal shot far up into the sky. As the camera of the heat ray hit the water, the latter had immediately flashed into steam. In another moment, a huge wave, like a muddy tidal bore but almost scaldingly hot, came sweeping round the bend upstream. I saw people struggling shorewards and heard their screaming and shouting faintly above the seething and roar of the Martian's collapse. For a moment, I heeded nothing of the heat, forgot the patent need of self-preservation. I splashed through the tumultuous water, pushing aside a man in black to do so until I could see round the bend. Half a dozen deserted boats pitched aimlessly upon the confusion of the waves. The fallen Martian came into sight downstream, lying across the river and for the most part submerged. Thick clouds of steam were pouring off the wreckage, and through the tumultuously whirling wisps I could see, intermittently and vaguely, the gigantic limbs churning the water and flinging a splash and spray of mud and froth into the air. The tentacles swayed and struck like living arms, and, save for the helpless purposelessness of these movements, it was as if some wounded thing was struggling for its life amid the waves. Enormous quantities of a ruddy brown fluid were spurting up in noisy jets out of the machine. My attention was diverted from this death flurry by a furious yelling, like that of a thing called a siren in our manufacturing towns. A man, knee-deep near the towing path, shouted inaudibly to me and pointed. Looking back, I saw the other Martians advancing with gigantic strides down the riverbank from the direction of Chertsey. The Shepperton guns spoke out this time unavailingly. At that, I ducked at once underwater, and, holding my breath until movement was in agony, blundered painfully ahead under the surface as long as I could. The water was in tumult around me, and rapidly growing hotter. When for a moment I raised my head to take breath and throw the hair and water from my eyes, the steam was rising in a whirling white fog that first hid the Martians altogether. The noise was deafening. Then I saw them dimly. Colossal figures of grey, magnified by the mist. They had passed me, and two were stooping over the frothing, tumultuous ruins of their comrade. The third and fourth stood beside him in the water, one perhaps 200 yards from me, the other towards Leyland. The generators of the heat rays waved high, and the hissing beams smote down this way and that. The air was full of sound. A deafening and confusing conflict of noises, the clangorous din of the Martians, the crash of falling houses, the thud of trees, fences, sheds flashing into flame, and the crackling and roaring of fire. Dense black smoke was leaping up to mingle with the steam from the river, and as the heat ray went to and fro over Weybridge, its impact was marked by flashes of incandescent white, and gave place at once to a smoky dance of lurid flames. The nearer houses stood still intact, awaiting their fate, shadowy, faint, and pallid in the steam, the fire behind them going to and fro. For a moment, perhaps, I stood there, breast high in the almost boiling water, dumbfounded at my position, hopeless of escape. Through the reek, I could see the people who had been with me in the river scrambling out of the water through the reeds, like little frogs hurrying through grass from the advance of a man, or running to and fro in utter dismay on the towing path. And suddenly the white flashes of the heat ray came leaping towards me. The houses caved in as they dissolved at its touch and darted out flames. The trees changed to fire with a roar. The ray flickered up and down the towing path, licking off the people who came this way and that, and came down to the water's edge not 50 yards from where I stood. It swept across the river to Shepperton, and the water in its track rose to a boiling wheel crested with steam. I turned shoreward. In another moment, the huge wave, well nigh at the boiling point, had rushed upon me. I screamed aloud, and scalded, half-blinded, agonized, I staggered through the leaping, hissing water towards the shore. Had my foot stumbled, it would have been the end. I fell hopelessly, in full sight of the Martians, upon the broad, bare, gravelly spit that runs down to mark the angle of the Wey and Thames. I expected nothing but death. Now that's what I call a different introduction to the podcast. Hello and welcome to The Only Way is Reading by Essex Library Services. I'm Amy and you've just been transported into H.G. Wells's The War of the World with my less than spectacular narration skills and the more than spectacular musical skills of our special guest today. Chris Adam is here today to talk all things soundscaping, electronic music and The War of the World in preparation for the exciting workshop he is running at Chelmsford Library on the 28th of October at 11 a.m. The workshop is for anyone aged 14 plus and will be soundscaping H.G. Wells's epic story. And if you don't know what soundscaping means, that's alright, I can tell you now. Soundscaping is the combination of sounds that form an immersive environment. It's quite like a soundtrack for film, except without the pop songs, and more with everyday sounds added with layers of atmospheric music. Anyway, here's me pretending to be an expert. We have an actual expert right here. Chris Adam, welcome to The Only Way is Reading.
Hi there.
How are you?
Yeah, not bad. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. So we have obviously just heard a fantastic example of a soundscape. Could you talk us through what you used to make it?
So what you've just heard is a soundscape using electronic instruments. In this case, this was made using synthesizers, which basically make noises from electronic circuits. The synthesizer there uses a modular approach, much like an electronic circuit, to create the sound. And a lot of the time it is up to the musician to choose how to patch it up, essentially, and how to make this big modular synth into a cool instrument that you can then make crazy noises out of.
That's very exciting and sounds incredibly complex. How did you get into making electronic music, and who or what inspired you?
Oh wow! I mean, that's quite an open-ended question, really. I mean, I always used to play a lot in bands, and there's a lot of stuff sort of band-wise. You have a lot of old sort of what's called krautrock, like Tangerine Dream, and they used to use a lot of electronic instruments in their music. And then there's sort of musicians from the 60s or 70s, such as Delia Derbyshire, obviously, and Wendy Carlos, who pioneered the use of electronic instruments and synthesizers in their music to create, a lot of the time, it was theme tunes to BBC TV shows and, background music here and there. One of my biggest inspirations as well is Brian Eno, who took the idea of what he calls wallpaper music, which I think that's a little bit of a cruel term, but and it kind of it definitely evokes something that falls into the background, much like sort of Muzak, but Brian Eno sort of made this thing where it was music that you could listen to and it would have as much detail in it if you listen to it carefully, but you could have it in the background as well. And a lot of the way that he approached stuff and developed stuff inspired a lot of musicians that I came to like later on, such as some of the more modern stuff like Aphex Twin, and yeah.
Do you think that because everything is now available to everyone, and I mean most people have a computer, whereas back when electronic music started, not everybody had access to a tape and recording devices and computers, that there's like an excess of electronic music that, and maybe like the quality has taken a hit?
I, as someone who's made rubbish for the past 15 years, I don't know whether I'm really qualified to answer that question. But no, in all seriousness, I like, it's one of those, it's a strange thing because, especially more on the experimental and the ambient side, there is a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of working through problems. I mean, for example, the Doctor Who theme tune is made from lots of different bits of tape spliced together. It was recorded. That was Delia Derbyshire, as far as I remember. And the way she did it was she recorded, I think, a theremin. Citation needed. But it was a theremin, and then she spliced a lot of the notes together to create that theme tune, the sort of what you hear on the thing. And obviously that kind of method comes with a lot of trial and error, a lot of cutting of tape back then. And even though nowadays things recording, we now have sort of the world of recording at our fingertips. I mean, I'm literally making things on my laptop that would have been completely impossible with the high-end studios of the BBC about 40-50 years ago. So we have all of this amazing production wealth at our fingertips, and I think it's a great thing. I think it's phenomenal. Without it, I wouldn't have learned how to make any kind of music whatsoever, because I come from a computer background. So I come from a background where I predominantly started recording for myself using a laptop, and then I moved on to synths and hardware later on when I enjoyed the way that they were more expressive in my opinion. They were more tangible. You can touch them, and you get sort of a reaction out of them, much like a real instrument, like a guitar or a synth. You get these kind of this cool feedback between you and the instrument that I think possibly working with a laptop you don't get. So I think that there are more people making things, and then that's a good thing. That without a doubt, yeah, that's brilliant.
You talked about cutting up and splicing tape. Have you ever done that?
Oh no, I actually that I don't know actually. I suppose I have cut up tape and I guess spliced it using sellotape on the old cassette and it didn't really
Nice.
give me. Yeah, it broke my cassette player, which is now still waiting to be fixed. So I've not done it again because I'm a little bit scared, and I'd have to borrow someone else's cassette recorder to do it, and I don't want to start, breaking other people's stuff.
I find it so incredible that splicing and tape and everything is like how electronic
Yeah.
music started. Like when you hear electronic, you think computer and modern technology. You don't think meticulous hours spent cutting up something so analog and sellotaping it back together in a certain way. It's an incredible that they figured out that that's how music works, and I can't even really say what I'm trying to say because it's so incredible to me.
It's interesting because we can't really imagine things outside of a computer now. It's become so prevalent in everything that we do that it includes the music, whereas back then obviously they weren't as prevalent in society as a whole. So it made more sense. And there are a lot of people I know who are older who absolutely love the fact that computers can now do about 90% of the tedious, boring work that they had to do in studios. And they fully embrace everything about computers, which is a really interesting thing because I came back from the other direction where I was sick of working in computers. We work in computers all the time, and that very prevalence that we have is what put me off working with them for something creative in a way. And so with music, which is obviously what I do, then it made sense for me to move into something that was more real, in my opinion, obviously.
Why do you think that sound is so important in telling a story?
So I think with narrative, with sort of storytelling, I mean, storytelling was, when you think about it, originally an audio sort of experience. That's a weird way of putting it, but it was told by word of mouth. It's a very weirdly technical way of putting it, but yeah. Stories were told by mouth originally, so it's one of those things that I think that actually hearing sounds that, or sort of audio that supplements a story, is kind of natural to us. I think there's an important element of imagination to reading and listening that possibly just watching something on the screen doesn't really give you. There's kind of a feedback between you and the author or the writer, where you are active in creating the story because you're imagining it yourself. So I think what's good about sound and audio and the soundscapes and things like that is that they help that sort of process in your brain, and they help you to imagine, to have that kind of feedback with the writer, to have that kind of it helps you have that interaction with the author that you don't necessarily get just absorbing something on a TV screen.
It's interesting that you say that you have an added interaction with the author without the visuals of a TV show or film. I'd never really thought about that before, but you're definitely onto something there. It's like whenever I've watched something and then gone to read the book or gone back to read the book, I can't help but like hear the actor's voice in my head, and their inflections and the landscape and faces are all copies of what I've seen rather than what I projected in my own imagination. Whereas sound alone definitely brings out the unique quality of putting you in the world, but allowing you to make up the rest in your mind.
I mean, that's very obvious when I mean, as you said, when lots of people like a book and they release it on TV or they release something like that, and they immediately go, oh, that, you get a huge amount of people saying that isn't right. It's not the way that I like. It's not, it's not the what I imagined in my head or whatever. Because everyone is ultimately imagining different things, so it can never be right.
Yeah. Speaking of adaptations, why do you love H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds? And why does it go so well with electronic music, do you think?
Oh yeah, the Jeff Wayne. I think the reason that War of the Worlds was so kind of ahead of its time is that there are lots of things about it that now we take as sort of these tropes in fiction that it kind of developed. So like the bit that we've just heard with the heat ray, that was something that was invented much later and is in fact what we now would call a laser, or some kind of plasma weapon, which is now kind of a trope that you hear all the time in science fiction. But it was one of those things that actually started off in that book, as well as this idea that I mean there were novels that talked about aliens and sort of other worlds, but this was the first novel that described aliens traveling in ships, in rockets, although in War of the Worlds they were shot from a gun rather than being the kind of rocket that we know now. It was, I think, a book that tried to give the impression of invasion from another perspective. So I mean, one of the interesting things that you sort of read about it is that it gives the impression of the English, who at the time were very much a great power. Although I suppose the British Empire at that point was slowly waning, but not so much. But it was definitely at sort of the height of its power, and so H.G. Wells was giving the readers a sort of the opposite perspective. So it was what it would be like to experience an invasion of a force or an army that was infinitely more powerful than you could ever fight back against. And that was what H.G. Wells was trying to get across with that. Well, yeah, there's a lot of themes about sort of the future, about future technology, about what would happen, about sort of modern technology and modern, almost kind of apocalyptic themes. So I think it lends itself quite well to sort of electronic instruments, because they tend to be seen as like a sort of futuristic instrument. I don't know if it's just because of the name. I mean, ultimately they're not really. Well, they are compared to, say, like a violin or a guitar or something like that. But I think that things that involve modern technology or futuristic technology or sort of science fiction probably lend themselves to electronic music because of that, because of this concept that they are sort of like a future instrument in a way.
Yeah. I adore that opening chapter, that opening in the first chapter, sorry, and the way it describes how humans are so small. And yeah, really linking to what you said about the Empire, there's that line, let me find it. Yeah. With infinite
Mm.
complacency, men go to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter, which I think is just fantastic. The little affairs and everything, it just really
Mm.
describes what you were just talking about. Um, and it also really measures humans up as cruel beings who truly believe in the superior. There's that line, minds that are to our minds, as ours are to those of the beasts that perish. I suppose you could also read it in a way of humans versus the natural world, as well as through its colonialist history. I'd love to have been there to see those reactions,
Mm.
and be involved in the frenzy when that first reading was led around on the radio.
Oh yeah, yeah. And it's so hard to do that kind of thing well, to sort of add this sense of foreboding already to a novel and not give away, or essentially he does give away what's going to happen, but and yet you, when it happens, it's still an enormous shock, especially sort of back then. um it would have been a huge shock to hear a lot about the how you know the heat ray kills people essentially, and a lot of the imagery in that is very shocking to people of that era.
Definitely. Um, there's a guy on TikTok who makes some very enjoyable videos about his favorite sounds, and I love asking people about that. So, what would you say your favorite sound is? Could you make it for us?
I see that. I see. I would do that, but everyone always takes the mick out of me when I do that.
Ah, safe space.
But I suppose, yeah. A lot of the I mean, there's so many different sounds that because of the nature of electronic music and the way that it kind of it not only deals with sort of melody, but it also deals with timbre. Um, so ultimately, well, in theory, you can make any kind of noise that you want, uh, because of the way that electronic music and the sort of process allows you to manipulate sounds. It's really hard to sort of say what exactly is my favorite sound. I definitely like some of the sounds in sort of drum and bass. There's a lot of a lot of the bass sounds in that which are almost sort of growly. A lot of the way that the sounds in drum and bass work with some of the bass lines are incredibly complicated sound design wise. There's a lot of stuff like a lot of sound design in films
Yeah,
can
it
be
makes me
absolutely
think
sort
of
of crazy.
Christopher Nolan's films and that bass that just goes through you. I love the it really travels through your whole body, kind of like the drum and
Yeah,
bass as
the
well.
Hans Zimmer horn sound. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's absolutely, it's kind of one of those things that is so iconic, and it's now everyone does it because it's such an effective thing to do.
Why do you love electronic music, and why do you think people who come to the workshop will enjoy it and enjoy making it as well?
You can get away from a lot of those rules in a very short time, even just by touching a button, or patching a cable in, or pressing a key. You can get away from these sounds that you've heard over these past hundreds of years, or whatever, or 50 or so, and you can be making something that no one will have heard before, and possibly no one will ever hear again. um, and that's kind of why I love it, because it gives you that ephemeral feeling of this is something that, even though it's only for myself, or even though it's only for a brief moment of time, that this is something new and interesting. And that's possible to do whether you've been doing it for a long time, or whether you've just picked it up within the past 5 minutes, and you picked up a synth, or you've picked up a laptop and pressed a button on it, and it's making a weird noise suddenly. That noise is interesting. um, Doing this workshop is supposed to sort of show people is that it the while the barrier of entry to music may seem high, because it may seem like you have to learn an instrument, it may seem like you need to know music theory or something like that. Actually, it really isn't. You can start making music on your laptop immediately. You can start, you can have a small keyboard or whatever lying around, and you can make music that is brilliant with that. And you don't need to know things. You can make weird noises that are just as valid and important to music as someone who can play 15 million notes a second on a guitar or whatever. Obviously that's no one can do that. Well, maybe
It'd be hard.
some computers can, and I've heard the computers do that, and it is weird, but yeah. So the point that I think the point of this workshop is mostly to introduce people into this idea that they can create sounds and music, and it's a valid form of expression no matter what you do. And also it hopefully gets people thinking about how to inspire themselves, not necessarily just in music, but in other creative ways. Because this, a lot of the time, even when I'm making music, I'll get a creative block, and I'll think, how do I get myself out of this creative block? And sometimes it's as simple as watching a film and going, well, what if I decided that I was going to write the soundtrack to the 5 minutes of my favorite film, or the chapter of my favorite book, and I suppose, and that can get you out of this creative rut, and it can work whether you're doing music, which is what I do, or whether you're doing art, painting or something. If you go away and say, oh, what if I just painted this picture from my favorite book or something, this image that I've got in my head, like we were saying, that I'm imagining in my head right now, and so there are ways of sort of using it in that kind of sense, as well as obviously the idea that we should be experiencing books and reading books and experiencing them, because they are like a wealth of amazing stories, information, and etc., etc.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
If you want to hear more from Chris, his musical artist name is Broken Atoms, and he can be found on Twitter as Broken Atoms with no O. And on Facebook, it's Broken Atoms spelt normally. If you want to get some inspiration for the Invasion Soundscaping Workshop, head to the Essex Library Services YouTube channel, where we have made a playlist inspired by the War of the Worlds and electronic music. And if you haven't already, make sure to reserve your place for the workshop on invasionworkshop.chelmsford.eventbrite.co.uk. The workshop is in half term on the 28th of October at 11 a.m. at Chelmsford Library. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you on the 28th of October. Bye!